Well, good morning, everyone. You know, this parable of the dishonest steward is a little bit of a head scratcher, don't you think? I mean, it seems to raise more questions than it answers. Questions like, why is the master commending this steward for what seems to be dishonest actions? And maybe more importantly, is Jesus really telling us that we should follow the example of this conniving man who seems to be motivated solely by his own self-interest? Well, over the centuries, people who are a lot smarter than me have debated these and other questions about this parable, and they've come up with a multitude of answers. And I am not going to pretend for a minute that I have the definitive answers. I don't. And so rather than examining the actions of the steward, I think it's worth asking, what is a steward? Right? What does a steward do? See, a steward is someone who is responsible for taking care of something that belongs to someone else. And the steward in the parable, he was basically the property manager for the rich man. And when he was called to make a full account of his stewardship, he quickly had to scramble to come up with a plan B because he knew that he could not make a good account. Well, what does that have to do with you and me? Well, we are stewards. You and I are stewards of the gifts that God has entrusted to our care. And what are the gifts that God has entrusted to our care? Well, it's basically everything. Everything we have, everything we are, every one of our accomplishments, they are all gifts from God. Our very lives are gifts from God. They do not belong to us. They belong to God. But as we go through this life, in this culture that seems to be steeped in selfishness and materialism, it's easy to start to think and act as if we are the masters and not the stewards. And that's what happened to the dishonest steward in the parable. He began to act as though he was the master. And when he was called to account, he was in for a rude awakening. And one day, you and I will be called to account for our stewardship of the gifts that God has entrusted to our care. And with that in mind, I think it's worth asking, what if that day was today? What if today I was called to account for the gifts that God has entrusted to my care? How prepared would I really be? Would I be like the dishonest steward, scrambling at the last minute, trying to come up with a plan B because I know that I cannot make a good account? Or would I be able to stand before God confidently, giving an honest and good account of my stewardship of the gifts that God has entrusted to my care? You know, when I was a young man, I worked for many years as a restaurant manager. So I was responsible for a business that belonged to someone else. And one of the most important things I did as a restaurant manager was to take inventory regularly so that I could have an objective look at my stewardship of the business, and I could make adjustments as necessary. And I can do the same thing with my life. I can take inventory, take an objective look at my stewardship of the gifts that God has entrusted to my care and evaluate. Am I using these gifts for the glory of God, or am I using them for my own self-interest? Am I serving God, or am I making myself the master? This morning, as we gather as a community of faith to listen to God's holy word, to be nourished by the precious body and blood of Christ Jesus, let us pause for a moment and reflect on our stewardship. Reflect on our role as steward of the gifts that God has entrusted to our care. And let us resolve to take inventory, to take stock of the gift, our stewardship of the gifts that God has entrusted to our care, and make the adjustments necessary to ensure that we are using those gifts for the glory of God, and that we are resisting that temptation to make ourselves the master.